everyone, welcome to Big Business This Week. I'm JD Durkin here on the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Another huge week in the world of business and economic news. That puts it lightly. The U.S.-China agree on at least a trade truce after a high-profile meeting in Geneva, plus how markets reacted after that major Saudi announcement from the president in recent days. Joining us here this week on the show to break it all down is Matt Peterson. He's the ideas editor at Barron's. Matt, really grateful for your time. We like to start off these conversations with a big picture view, the 30,000-foot view of things. Give me your sense on how markets have been responding as of late after a very choppy few weeks, going back to April 2nd, Matt.
Oh, it's very easy. Markets love it. Markets are thrilled. Everything is great. There's no trouble on the horizon. That's basically what we've heard from the stock market over the last couple of days. S&P as of Tuesday, I think, was up 4% just on Monday and Tuesday alone, right? No sign that we went through any of this kind of tariff turmoil.
Does the bounce back kind of surprise you here? I mean, we always know investors are always looking for the silver lining. They're looking for the good news, especially in times of chop and volatility. But it kind of seems as if the worst of those Liberation Day jitters pretty quickly put behind us.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really the big question that everybody's asking about where the market is right now is, are stocks sort of too exuberant? And it's hard to say, right? I mean, we have made up all of those gains since April 2nd, Liberation Day. We're still down a little as we're talking right now from, the beginning of the sort of tariff talk in February. But the question is, how long can this last, right? And what everybody's waiting for is to see real signs in the data that there is some sort of significant economic hit coming from the tariffs, such as they are, right? I mean, we are left with pretty significant tariffs, even after the kind of climb downs we've seen on China and everything else. Somebody pointed out to me, you remember that poster that Trump rolled out on April 2nd with all the numbers on it, big scary numbers? That poster has been canceled, but we're still getting some tariffs. And so we're in this moment where we just kind of don't know yet what the economic data is, but stocks are looking positive for now.
Yeah, and obviously there's a lot of other factors. We're still, for the most part, in the heart of earnings season. We're still very closely watching the Fed and some of those inflation gauges. I'm curious on that inflation data. Obviously, there's a difference between soft data and hard data. And you got the economics on the one side, and then you got these consumer sentiment surveys, Matt, where small businesses, big businesses, individual consumers, they say things may be okay right now, but I don't have a great prognosis for how I feel the rest of the year is going to shape out. What do you make of the kind of differences we've seen between that so-called soft data, the sentiment surveys, versus the hard data? They kind of appear to be painting two different pictures right now.
Yeah, sentiment is a mess. There's no doubt about it. But there has been a big debate among economists over the last few years, not just now, about how predictive this sentiment actually is. I talked to Steve Myron, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, the other day. He was saying, we believe that this sentiment data is so partisan now that you really can't infer anything about where spending is actually going from it. And that's not a crazy point of view. That's something that a lot of economists have been questioning for now. I mean, look, there is a point at which the soft data starts to slip into the hard data, but we didn't see it, for instance, in the inflation numbers that we got, consumer price index data this week. We saw relatively moderate readings there. We saw inflation up, I think, 2.3% over last April, right? That's a little higher than where we were, before COVID, but it's not a terrible number here at all, and certainly not in light of what people are talking about sudden price rises coming out of China and other, big countries that ship a lot of goods to the U.S., right? So, for now, the hard data is still relatively stable, and we've had lots of companies, doing relatively well despite pulling their earnings, right? So it's a pretty strongly mixed message.
It's fascinating to watch the number of companies that are outright pulling guidance altogether for 2025, clearly communicating to the market, we can't even give you a sense of where we're going. United Healthcare is the real big one, really putting downward pressure on the Dow here in recent days. I want to clarify one thing you said. I think you said you spoke with a White House official. Was the idea there on some of those sentiment surveys, that soft data, that politics, personal politics, can cloud the responses? In other words, if you're a Democratic voter, you're more inclined to feel sour about the projections of the Trump economy because of your personal politics, and vice versa?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. And that really does show up in the data, right? You can see, the University of Michigan, for instance, which puts out some of this sentiment data, will show you what Republicans think versus what Democrats think. And yeah, exactly. Democrats just hate the Trump economy. Similarly, Republicans hated the Biden economy, even though the Biden economy was pretty good. I'm willing to say that just as, an objective economic fact. We would love to be where we were at the end of December here, right? But we're maybe not that far from it. But yeah, right, exactly. What we're seeing is it's very hard to survey people about what they think about the economy, because what people think about the economy, is affected by their voting patterns, by what they worry about, in immigration policy and all the rest of the stuff. Like that comes out in these surveys just as much as that comes out in these surveys maybe a little more clearly than like their specific plans to spend or cut their own consumption.
So we're in the middle. When you and I are doing this interview, we're in between the CPI and the PPI prints. Are you in the camp that says we already would have seen the early rollout of the tariffs, or are you closer to the camp of those in recent days who have said even these inflation prints are not yet reflecting that real first burst of early April aggressive shift in tariff policy?
Yeah, I'm in the camp that we haven't quite seen it yet. I think, you just like we were talking about on these earnings calls, there's so many CEOs that are paying really, really close attention to tariff data, and it's just really hard to believe that there's going to be, nothing. And the Fed, for instance, has been pretty clear about what it thinks about this. The Fed thinks that we're going to see some prices increase, but that's not the real worry for them. The real worry is whether or not you go into this sustained cycle of price increases, right? Does it gets a little more expensive to import stuff from China, for instance, that if you're a manufacturer using to build stuff, that makes your output a little more expensive, right? Is that a one-time thing, or does that last for the course of your business forever? And so we haven't been in this long enough to know really whether or not these changes are going to be sticky. Like, I think we would all be pretty surprised if we didn't see some increase in prices, because the overall level of tariffs has gone up a lot. But and I hate to say this because people hate to hear that prices going up is not the end of the world, but like an occasional increase in prices is probably not going to wreck the economy. The real worry is that people think, the prices are going to be up forever and the Fed can't control that, and then they start asking for, higher rewards on US Treasuries and stuff like that, and that gets into this cycle where mortgages get more expensive for the long run, right? Like that cycle hasn't happened yet. So we don't know yet whether we're in that.
Would you argue, if you don't mind me popping in quickly, would you argue we've seen glimpses of it with the bond vigilante move that we had a few weeks ago? The bond market clearly communicating, hey, we're not going to rotate to the safe havens in the light of increased market volatility. With all due respect, Mr. President, like we're not going to play that game. I feel like we had investors saying we're willing to pay that premium in terms of treasuries and kind of throw things out of whack. Have we seen that at least a little bit so far?
Oh, 100% we've seen that. And yes, I think the real political story is happening in the bond markets. That's where, we'll find much more important longer term effects. And basically what's happened is that investors all over the world have said, it's a little bit more risky to hold treasuries than it is to hold cash. And so yields on treasuries have gone up across the board, across the yield curve, from the short end stuff to the really longer term debt. It's the longer term debt that, we need to see the yield on the 10-year, for instance, come down, the yield on the 10-year treasury, in order for mortgages, car loans, that stuff to get cheaper. And that's not happening. And the spikes in those kinds of debt were really what made, the Trump administration back off of its plans to go full bore into these big April 2nd reciprocal tariffs that spooked the markets, right? And so a lot of that pressure has eased, but it's not gone out of the markets entirely. We've still got a 10-year treasury trading in the range of 4.5%, right? Basically, if you think about where the budget needs to be long term, you want it to be closer to like 3.5, 3.8 or something like that in order for us to be able to afford those debt costs in the long run. So, this scenario where, the economy is doing pretty well and treasury yields, long-term treasury yields stay in the mid 4.5%, 5% range, that's not great for the U.S. economy in lots of ways.
Yeah, to your point, I was checking while we were talking. It is right now exactly at 4.5, and you go back even to April, shortly after so-called Liberation Day. It's the lowest it went in this recent cycle was just below 4%. I mean, it was really just, and so we've been kind of seesawing back and forth now to a higher level that we've seen in some time. Let's drill down on the China deal while we can, while we have a few minutes here. What do you make of the announcement? Obviously, I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions with regards to what happens after the 90-day. Do these numbers get scaled back? And all of the challenges, Matt, that leads for companies trying to throw into the mix forward-looking guidance. But hey, for whatever it's worth, we've cooled the rhetoric. We've brought down the numbers. Besson and Greer and company went off to Geneva. They came back with what they say is what's the phrase they kept using? Meeting mechanism? I was trying to watch all of Besson's remarks very closely, and I was like, well, there's a lot of phrases you could use. Meeting mechanism is one of them. What do you make out of what we heard the last few days?
Oh boy, yes, we've got a meeting mechanism. And by the way, the Biden administration had a meeting mechanism, and the Obama administration had a meeting mechanism, and even the first Trump administration had a meeting mechanism. Yeah, look, I mean, this is the question here, right? As you said, Besant and Greer, came out of their meetings in Geneva and said, you know what? All of this volatility, all of this chaos in the markets was worth it because now we've put the big issues on the table and we've got their attention. Okay, fine. Let's just assume that that's true. Now they need to actually deliver, right? They need to show us the money in terms of some sort of concrete progress with China. Otherwise, all we've got here really, are higher costs on stuff that comes out of China, which is a lot of the stuff that we use in our daily lives. So that's got to be worth something. And to make it worth something, Besant and Greer need to go, for instance, to do something about make the Chinese auto industry more fairly competitive with ours, right? BYD is out there selling cars into, say, the Mexican market. I went to Mexico City, February, everywhere you got picked up in an Uber, nice American company there, but they're, the drivers are driving Chinese taxis, right? They're driving BYDs. That's where, we're seeing huge global competition between Tesla and Chinese companies. And, the administration's argument has been these companies, Chinese companies, big exporters, are over-subsidized, and they want the Chinese to somehow pull back on this, and put us on a fair competitive playing field with them, right? How they're going to do that, I'm really not sure. This has been something, like I said, that every administration for 20 years basically has been arguing with the Chinese about, and what we've learned from the way that the administration has responded to the markets is that there's only so much the U.S. government can do to push its tariff policy forward when the markets don't like it. The Chinese don't have that problem, right? It's great to be a dictator when you're, for better or for worse here. So they really have, quite a bit of leverage. I wouldn't necessarily say the Chinese have more leverage than us, but it's just not a foregone conclusion what the U.S. can get out of these negotiations with China. And it's just too early in the process to have seen any meaningful evidence one way or another that this is actually going to go anywhere. So I'm holding my breath here to see what, if there are any actual concrete gains we're going to get out of this beyond the volatility.
They drive BYDs in Mexico City?
Yeah, they absolutely do. That's pretty nice for what it's worth, I didn't mind.
I bet they are. Do you know, are they doing autonomous the way Waymo does out in like San Francisco, or they're not there yet in terms of the market?
Yes, they're working on an autonomy plan. I mean, the Chinese AI push is pretty well developed, across all these frontiers, including on autonomous vehicles. And yeah, I mean that's probably where the real competition comes from for Waymo, for what it's worth, is from Chinese companies rather.
And certainly for Tesla, in terms of revenue exposure and market exposure overseas, in terms of biggest competitor and a competitor that has increased its own market share in a really crucial playground or sandbox, so to speak, for Tesla. Let me ask you about the UK deal, because it's different from China. It's, UK is in a different category of countries in terms of trade deficit versus trade surplus. We didn't really see the market react to huge positive news off of the UK deal. Was there anything in there that was noteworthy, or was that a little more window dressing than substance, you think?
There's some noteworthy stuff in the deal that's kind of small. It's not window dressing, but it's not really market moving in the short run. The thing that's happening in this UK deal is that we are basically aligning kind of national security and trade policy in a way that China doesn't like. So what we've done is we've included some provisions basically for the United Kingdom to get preferential access on things like steel and cars, if we can basically all agree that they're doing something to kind of keep the Chinese out, right? So we're basically setting up preferential trade for our closest security partners, the United States, right? And that's obviously the United Kingdom would be on very high on anybody's list of closest U.S. security partners. And so the Chinese came out yesterday and started objecting to this, right? In the scope of things, it's kind of small, right? This isn't going to affect very much trade, but like you can sort of squint at this and see the outlines of a bigger deal where the United States goes to Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, countries that are sort of more marginal in their relationship with the United States and say, like, if you get in our security bubble, then we will put you in the trade bubble too, and we will lock China out, right? And so the Chinese see this and they're really worried about that. It's not clear that really has legs. It's part of the first agreement with the kind of closest political ally of the United States, and there's still a lot of details that remain to be worked out about how this is kind of work in practice. But that, if you talk to the people, the sort of intellectual voices around the administration, including Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, they will say this is how we sort of have a big vision that we attach to these individual deals. Is like we make a kind of closer security relationship with the closest U.S. economic partners.
Let's now move on to Saudi Arabia. This is once again the first trip abroad for President Trump. They're announcing a lot of announcements coming out of that trip. Let's start with the $600 billion investment in the U.S. in a series of deals. What do you make of the president's choice to once again return to Riyadh, essentially as his first overseas trip, through the lens of general diplomacy and geopolitics? And number two, what stands out to you about any of the announcements we heard from the president while he was there?
Yeah. Hey, the president went where the money is, and you could tell by the list of CEOs who went with him, right? I mean, it's this long list of luminaries, including Elon Musk, Steve Schwartzman, Ruth Porat from Alphabet. Long list. I'm forgetting the names. There's like 40 or 50 of them, but basically like a huge list of A-list CEOs from the U.S. went alongside there, and that's because there's just a ton of money sloshing around in Saudi Arabia that like everybody on Wall Street and in U.S. business wants to get their hands on. And so it makes perfect sense that Trump is going to go over there and try to do business and try to bring back these deals. This is the narrative, again, we've heard from the administration, is that they've got trillions of dollars of U.S. investment, of foreign investment coming back to the United States from the kingdom and from lots of other global investors. We do, again, sort of need to actually see some of this working in practice, because there has been a lot of kind of double counting of these numbers. And so, I haven't gone through the Saudi specific deals enough yet to have a strong opinion about whether or not any of this money is actually going to go through. But the bigger story here is probably that, the administration wants to keep the Saudis on side and seems to be doing that. We are seeing oil prices stay in a relatively low range. I mean, that wasn't really the headline of Trump's trip here, but it's absolutely the mood music when we're talking about Saudi Arabia, is that the Saudis have been willing to act to keep oil prices low, which is something that U.S. oil producers kind of hate. People remember that back during COVID, the Saudis, went really aggressively and tried to expand market share and undercut a lot of U.S. shale producers. And there's worries that this will happen again, worries from, U.S. producers. This has been the kind of weird flip side of the way that the administration talks about energy, is that, they say that they want to be a friend to the U.S. energy industry, and I think that's true in a lot of senses, but they're also totally willing to greenlight the Saudis, really ramping up production in ways that brings down oil prices that's uncomfortable for U.S. producers. It's great if you're going to plan a road trip this summer. Oil prices are still you're trending around $3 a gallon nationally, which is sort of good for American consumers. There's the geopolitical upside to this in that it helps squeeze the Iranians too, right? It's help squeeze the Russians as well. So that's the kind of flip side of the Saudi trip that's not getting as much attention as the the investment stuff, and maybe just as consequential.
And obviously, there's other parts of the trip, the Palace in the Sky airplane coming from Qatar, and what happens there with regards to it being a gift to the president that not clear other presidents will be able to use. But I appreciate the fact that you brought up some of those lesser discussed components of the trip. And wild to see people like Sam Altman. I mean, you're right, that list went on and on of everyone who suddenly, I'm like looking at the news the last few days, I'm like, oh, you're also in Riyadh. Oh, okay, cool. I see. Like everyone got the memo here.
They left us behind. What were we doing? Yeah.
What are you and I doing here? We're still stuck here in New York. That looks like a good trip. Matt, I always know it's a killer conversation when I can genuinely do it for at least another hour. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, and I'm really grateful for your time, man. I hope you'll rejoin us again soon. My special thanks to Matt Peterson. He is the ideas editor at Barron's. Matt, thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Talk to you soon.